What do you get when you combine a pastor, an ancient spirit, a male stripper, and a Christian's men conference? Well, you'll find out today. And we have a lot of news to get to. Trump's hush money trial, a man on fire, campus protesting and demonstrations over Israel and Palestine, gun control, and the gender pay gap. Phew. Buckle up for episode 32. I'm Blake Watson, and this is We the Free. One of the best ways you can help our show other than by sharing the content is by picking up some We the Free merch at wethefreeshow.com. You can be the salt and light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt, or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt, and of course, the classic We the Free crest tee. We've even got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle, so check out our new merch at wethefreeshow.com. If you're a freebie, you've surely at least heard the name Mark Driscoll, but I'd say that most of you know who Mark Driscoll is. He's currently the senior pastor at Trinity Church in Arizona. He was one of the co-founders of Mars Hill Church in Seattle in 1996, but he resigned that position in 2014 for allegations of plagiarism, misuse of church funds, and an alleged toxic work environment. But here we are a decade later. Mark is leading a different church, and a lot of the clips I've seen from him lately, speaking about marriage and parenting, etc., is pretty solid material. But I took a deeper interest in Mark last year because he had just written a book about demonic forces and evil spirits. I think we may talk more about this in the future because it would take an entire episode at least, and then some, to explain some of his points there. I was actually working on a 6-part lesson series. It's like 4 hours of content total, explaining the origins of evil, who Satan is and what he's like, what demons are and what they're capable of doing, possession, etc., how demons respond to Christ. I was researching all of this material, 4 hours worth of content, when I came across Mark's book. It's called New Days, Old Demons. Here it is right here. New Days, Old Demons. Now, when a mega church pastor is releasing a new book, he'll coincide the release of that book with a sermon series, usually. Now, here's the video that they made to announce this sermon series and just by relation, the book.
You have a greater wisdom than all the wisdom of Solomon. He said, you're blind, you cannot see the truth. You're deaf, and you cannot hear the truth. He said, I'm the truth. I'm the light of the world. I'm the sign.
If you're listening on the podcast, there was a lot of modern imagery depicting much of the chaos, division, and cultural rot that we have here in America, along with several text lines which read the following: God creates, Satan counterfeits. Repentance versus tolerance. Good versus evil. Angels versus demons. Prophets versus false prophets. Purity versus perversion. And finally, God and Elijah versus Ahab and Jezebel. That's a key distinction, that last one, for our conversation today. In each of those lines, there's a discernible component of spiritual warfare, two sides warring against each other. Yes, Satan, the god of this world, the deceiver, the prowling lion seeking someone to devour, the divider, the destroyer, he opposes the Lord, obviously. Culturally speaking, he juxtaposed repentance and tolerance next to each other. Repentance being a total reversal in direction, a changing of your mind, a transformation from, the zombified person we were and into the man or woman of God we were meant to be, versus accepting and affirming sin and evil. And in the spiritual realm, we have the competing forces of angels and demons. That's another comparison that was made. The latter being corrupted and the corrupted and fallen form of the former. He counters prophets and false prophets. Prophets are those who speak for God. They convey the message of God. False prophets speak for the God of this world or for themselves. They only spread lies and falsehood. Purity versus perversion is pretty self-explanatory. And then you have God and Elijah versus Ahab and Jezebel. We obviously know who God is, and you should know who the prophet Elijah is, but maybe you're unfamiliar with King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Ahab was king of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 9th century BC. He married a Phoenician princess named Jezebel around 860 BC. Well, she comes from a place who worships the two false gods that we talked about in episode 30, Baal and Ashtoreth. Baal is mentioned all throughout the Old Testament, in Judges, 1 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Hosea, Zephaniah. In total, the name in its singular or its plural form with Balaam occurs 80 times. The Semitic name simply means Lord or Master. That's what Baal means, Lord or Master. So contextually and historically, Baal was just the general name that was given to gods that were not Yahweh. Baal was associated with things mainly concerning agriculture, which is to say that he was the god of wealth or material wealth. Ashtoreth, the other one, is only mentioned a few times in the Old Testament, but this goddess went by different names in different cultures, like Astarte to the Phoenicians, Ishtar to the Mesopotamians, and Aphrodite to the Greeks. She was the goddess of love and sex, fertility, romance, and reproduction. And around the writing of the commandments, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites worshipped this goddess by sacred prostitution in her temple, just as the Greeks would do in their day. That's why the letters that were written to the Corinthian believers talk so much about sexual immorality. In other words, the two main areas of idol worship in the Old Testament days were materialism and sex. These are the gods and goddesses that Jezebel's people worshipped. So that's where she's coming from. And since she became queen over the Jewish people who worshipped Yahweh, the one true God, she exercised her influence, her great influence, over her husband, King Ahab, to steer the people into worshiping these two false deities and to punish those who wouldn't comply. 1 Kings 18 describes her persecution and murder of the Lord's prophets, and that chapter talks about Jezebel feeding 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah at her table. But the prophet Elijah was essentially God's representative and fiercely condemned all of this to the king's face. So you can see in the story these opposing figures, Elijah and Jezebel, respectively representing good versus evil, God and Satan, purity versus perversion, etc. All this to say, Jezebel was the primary figure in leading God's people, the Israelites, into idolatry, not only in the form of worshiping graven images, but in worshiping materialism and sex. But there's more. 1 Kings 16 gives a summary of King Ahab, his whole reign over Israel, stating the following: Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And it came about, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So it's recorded right there that King Ahab was the most evil king in Israel's history. And this is attributed to his idol worship, spearheaded by his wife, the Queen Jezebel. He built places of worship for Baal and Ashtoreth. And verse 33 mentions something really specific at one of these idolic places of worship, one of these temples. It says that King Ahab made the Asherah. Asherah was basically the same kind of goddess as Ashtaroth, but she was represented by a pole or a pillar. So these were sacred objects. And in fact, we see these poles referenced numerous times in the Old Testament. Like there's one, they're referenced in Deuteronomy 7:5 and Deuteronomy 12:3, where God is telling the Israelites to destroy these poles. And then in Deuteronomy 16, verses 21 through 22, this is what it says. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make for yourself. You shall not set up for yourself a sacred pillar, which the Lord your God hates. The biblical character Gideon is the first one we see carrying out the destruction of these poles. And throughout Kings and Chronicles, we see a lot of erecting these idolic poles and also tearing them down. For example, King Manasseh of Judah builds one in the temple of the Lord. And then King Josiah, just 2 chapters later, destroys it. Getting back to Jezebel, though, Jesus references her in Revelation 2:20 as he speaks against the church of Thyatira, saying, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray so that they commit acts of immorality." And that's the Greek word pornuo at the end, meaning it's sexual immorality. And you have to keep in mind that these churches in Revelation are largely symbolic. They represent a non-specific group of people. And so don't necessarily get caught up on the name of where the church is, the name the church is given. Pay attention to the characteristics of the church. Jesus commends them for their love and their faith and their service, etc. But then he rebukes them for their idolatry and their sexual immorality. The fact that Jesus includes this reference to Jezebel all the way back from 1 Kings gives us this idea of a Jezebel spirit. This symbolic church is rebuked for being led into the worship and glorification of sex, just as Queen Jezebel had such influence over the Israelites in ancient Israel. Now, one could easily draw many parallels from the ancient Jezebel and King Ahab, as well as the symbolic kind of Jezebel spirit from whom this metaphorical church in Revelation suffered, to American society today. It's quite obvious that we have abandoned worshiping the one true God, and we've turned to idolatry, worshiping ourselves by means of sex and materialism. Of all the places and peoples on the earth right now, Americans glorify and worship sex way above everyone else by a long shot. We are normalizing pedophilia right now. There's people actually fighting the so-called for the so-called right to chop up their bodies and inject themselves with hormones to make their bodies physically comport with their mental confusion, sexually speaking. People are shrieking in the streets because they can't have unabashed sex without the biological consequences. We have pedophiles who put on woman face that are being openly welcomed to come read books to children in public libraries. The top pornography site on the planet reports that the United States accounts for most of its traffic. In fact, we're first place by more than double what the UK has in second place. We're no different from King Ahab's and Queen Jezebel's Israel. We're no different than Corinth in Paul's day. And we're no different from this corrupted church in Revelation. In fact, we're probably way worse. Frankly, you could replace the name Thyatira for America and it would work just fine. Mark Driscoll's book, New Days, Old Demons, digs really deep into this idea, along with progressive Christianity, woke politics, transgenderism, and more. Again, we're not going to get deep into the specifics of his book. You can read it yourself. But this is just the biblical backdrop for what you're about to see. Mark was invited to speak at a men's conference at James River Church in Springfield, Missouri. James River is led by Pastor John Lindell. I'm not going to tell you anything about this man. You can draw your own conclusions as I report the facts. I'm going to show you the commercial for the conference in just a minute, but we'll start with a video showing one of the opening acts. Just keep in mind everything that we've talked about with Jezebel misleading God's people, King Ahab erecting the Ashura, etc. And watch this. His name is Alex Magala. He's a former male stripper who is stripping. He rips his shirt off. He's climbing a tall pole. Hello, a pole. And then he pulls out a sword, licks the entire blade, and then sticks it down his throat. And it goes on from there. But I think you get the idea. This is how they opened one of the sessions. Well, the next day, Mark Driscoll is scheduled to speak, and this is what happens.
Let me do this. I've been up since 1 o'clock in the morning. The reason I'm hoarse is I have been praying for you, and my heart is very burdened for you. And I want to be very careful with this, and it's not what I want to say. But the Jezebel spirit has already been here. The Jezebel spirit opened our event. This is a rebuke and a correction of no one. This is an observation. Before the Word of God was open, there was a platform. It was a high place. On it was a pole, an Ashura. The same thing that's used in the strip club for women who have the Jezebel spirit to seduce men. In front of that was a man who ripped his shirt off like a woman does in front of a pole at a strip club. That man then ascended. See, our God is not arrogant. He doesn't ascend. Our God is humble. He descends. And then he swallowed a sword, and Jesus cried, okay, Pastor John, I'll receive that. Thank you.
Mark Driscoll calls all of this out, and rightfully so. He references all of the things that I've told you, which is what he details greatly in his book. And hopefully, now that you've heard me explain the biblical context, you realize that this isn't a publicity stunt, and it's not Mark trying to hawk his book to enrich himself. I mean, seriously, you don't write a book condemning the worship of sex in our culture because of how much love and support you'll get for it. You write a book on this subject because it's what plagues our society more than anything else. Way more. How could he not call this out as a pastor? Well, you heard the church's pastor, John Lindell, shutting Mark down there at the end of the clip. He was saying, "You're done, Mark. You're out of line." And you see Mark just calmly say, "All right, I got it." And then he picks up his things and he leaves the stage. In fact, he left the building. So now, in this awkward moment, the senior pastor gets up, and this is what happens. Again, this is at a Christian men's conference. Watch.
Let me just say this. Get up! If Mark wanted to say that, he should have said it to me first. He didn't. Matthew 18. If your brother offends you, go to him privately. I talked to Mark for a half hour. There was not one word of that.
A lot of people online, albeit biblically ignorant people, have criticized Mark on the same reasoning that Mark should have followed the process outlined by Christ in Matthew chapter 18. But that only applies to private matters. This was quite the public matter. So while Matthew 18 encourages believers to first go to their offending brother in private to settle personal disputes and interpersonal transgressions, Mark didn't even mention John Lindell's name. He never says his name. He condemns something that happened. And I know that this is John's church, but this was obviously a criticism of a moment at the event. That's all that he talks about. And you should handle public transgressions publicly. That's what Mark did. This story is still unfolding. It's a lot of stupid drama, but I'll summarize it for you. John got Mark to come back to the stage, and the two of them had a discussion about that conflict in front of everyone, during which John talks about not criticizing God's anointed, which makes me want to vomit all over the place. Mark would eventually recommend privately that John's son step up and lead James River Church because it's obviously hurtling over a slippery slope of idolatry and secularism, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Lindell would publicly criticize Mark for his private matter, a direct violation of Matthew 18, which he cited earlier. And he has since publicly apologized, John Lindell has, for inviting the male stripper / sword swallower and for inviting Mark. Like, sorry everyone, it was a mistake to invite the man who humiliated me. So all of this criticism is worth talking about, and kudos to Mark for calling it out and for writing a book on the subject. But here's my criticism. I think that the whole conference is indicative of the American church's cancerous problem, which is secularism. I mean, just take a look at the commercial for the event, and then let's talk about it.
Be ready to fight everything. Tell them I'm ready for anything.
Can God trust you to go in the battle, get wounded, and have the mentality and the mindset? I'm still gonna fight.
Ready for anything.
So there was boxing, motorcycles and stunts, monster trucks, bull riding, Indiana Jones, music which is largely indistinguishable from secular music. Oh, and don't forget the male stripper sword swallower. Now, while I would undoubtedly agree that men are suffering from a severe lack of biblical manliness and true masculinity, this appeal to entertainment, the circus act, and the secular atmosphere at this event, which is not too dissimilar from a normal week at megachurches all around the country, this is what happens when Jesus isn't enough. Jesus isn't cool enough or fun enough. So we've got to suck people in with all of this stuff. And the deeper issue is that the American church and the Western church too has totally forgotten what it means to be holy, which is our command from the Lord. He says, be holy as I am holy. We're supposed to be totally distinct from the world. There should be an obvious difference between the non-believer and the believer. In fact, the word translated to holy in both the Old and the New Testament means to be separate or set apart. And that's not saying to be isolated from the world, because that defies our ministry of evangelism. Instead, you could summarize it by saying that Christians are to be in the world, just not of it. If you took all the speech and text out of that commercial, not a single person would know it was a Christian event. It looks like a circus with a concert. And this is an increasing problem in churches all across America. I think this also speaks to an important point about the spiritual battle that we face. Many pastors and Christians will use this scripture to dissuade you from personal confrontation and conflict. But let's look at this again in light of everything that we've discussed already. Paul says in Ephesians 6:12 that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Some people will criticize Mark, saying that he shouldn't have said what he said at or about the conference. Some people will criticize me for saying the things that I say, because I not only attack ideas and philosophies, as Paul alludes to in that verse, I will rebuke and criticize a person or an individual or a whole group of people who espouse or promote an idea which is evil and destructive and tyrannical or just blatantly wrong. And the criticism from Christians is not to attack a person, because we don't battle against flesh and blood. Okay, well, what about Jesus? He scorned the Pharisees publicly and to their faces. What about Paul? What about Jehu, who in 2 Kings 9:30-37 had Jezebel, that we've already talked about, thrown out of a window, trampled by horses, and eaten by dogs? Sure, these horrible, awful, no good things come straight from the pits of hell, but they're in the form of ideas and philosophies, and then they're carried out by people, by men and women in leadership. Hence the reason that Paul says that we're battling against rulers. You see this perfectly depicted in all of these stories. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, they're the leaders of Israel. They led them into idolatrous practice of sexual worship and paganism, as did the leader of the Revelation Church in Thyatira. You see this from the top down at this men's conference, and you see this in our country today. Our leaders in government and in our churches are pushing us further and faster away from Christ and toward the same gods Israel worshipped in idolatry. Honestly, we need more people like Mark Driscoll to call it out and condemn it for what it really is. Stand up, speak out, and let your voices be heard. Now let's get to the news feed. Well, I've got to say something about Trump's hush money trial in New York. I've waited to say something about this, but surveys and polling are showing that most Americans are seeing a lopsided justice system and a political prosecution here, regardless of the facts about the case. I think a truly just system of justice would throw just about every politician in prison, but that's not what we have. The near 100 charges being thrown at Donald Trump in the lead up to the election is quite obviously a political prosecution. And yes, it does trickle down from Biden and his Department of Justice. The Democrat connections to these judges and prosecutors and special counsels, etc., is undeniable. You cannot deny it. But let's talk about this case in particular and its validity. Here are the alleged facts about this case. A payment was made days before President Trump's election in 2016 through Trump's attorney at the time, Michael Cohen, to an adult film actress, we'll call her, Stephanie Clifford. Her pretend name is Stormy Daniels, and her other pretend name is Karen McDougal. Michael Cohen allegedly gave her $130,000 in exchange for her silence about an alleged affair. And Trump, of course, denies that there was any such relationship. The prosecutors are saying that Michael Cohen was reimbursed by the Trump organization under the guise of legal services, and these payments were spread out over 12 months. So, because of all this, Trump is facing 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, to which he's pleading not guilty. This points to the paper trail of payments, which is irrefutable. What is the legitimacy of accusations of infidelity? I don't know. It's a he said, she said kind of situation right now. Many will point to the payments as some sort of proof of the affair, but it could be explainable by a simple fact that Trump was in an unprovable corner. I mean, we're still kind of in this Me Too era where a woman can just accuse a man of anything, and if the man can't disprove her claims, he's destroyed, and she stands upon this heap of his destruction. So if a woman emerges threatening to say this or that, and you can't readily combat those claims, Trump and Cohen's plan was to pay her not to do that. And again, I don't know. I know that he's not some moral exemplar, but it's incredibly important to remember what Miss Clifford herself said in 2018. She wrote and posted the following. Over the past few months, I've been asked countless times to comment on reports of an alleged sexual relationship I had with Donald Trump many, many, many years ago. The fact of the matter is that each party to this alleged affair denied its existence in 2006, 2011, 2016, and now again in 2018. I'm not denying this affair because I was paid hush money, as has been reported in overseas-owned tabloids. I'm denying this affair because it never happened. And then she hand-signed the statement and posted it online. As far as this case is concerned, that's quite damning evidence, despite Ms. Clifford contradicting her own statement many times in the last 6 years. That's why none of the news outlets are talking about it. But we don't need to get too deep into the weeds of the case here. It's obviously intent on throwing mud on Trump and pulling him from campaigning right now. They wouldn't allow him to even be with his wife on her birthday. They wouldn't let him attend his own son's graduation. It's ridiculous. And it's also a massive political miscalculation, I think, on the part of the Democrats. Poll after poll after poll is showing that Trump's support and popularity go up after every trial, every charge, and every accusation. So they think that they're tarnishing Trump when they're actually helping him win. Speaking of the Trump trial in New York, you probably heard about a man setting himself on fire outside of the courthouse. He died in the hospital shortly after the incident. the sickening thing from the very beginning of this event, other than the self-immolation, was the mainstream media attempting to make this person out to be a flaming Trump supporter. No pun intended. Well, that was a complete fabrication, because we had a manifesto from the guy. It was posted even before he did what he did. He was burning himself next to a sign, which I'll show you in just a second. And we also have his political donation records. So the media really flubbed that one. I counted dozens of times that he donated to Act Blue. That's a fundraising organization for Democratic and progressive candidates. He even made a couple of donations to Bernie Sanders in 2020. You know, Bernie, the old red communist responsible for the nation's economic policy right now. Now, here's a photo of his sign. I'm not going to show you the video or his burning body, but just take a look at this. This is him just before this happens, and the sign reads, "Trump is with Biden, and they're about to fascist coup us." I know that fascism is a word that's thrown around a lot these days, but really the term doesn't apply to either Biden or Trump. Hitler or Mussolini are the most infamous fascists in all of history. Biden is more of a Marxist, while Trump is neither fascistic or a communist. The defining feature in both of those political systems is authoritarianism and totalitarianism. They both require absolute control to accomplish their goals. And if you disagree with me, you just need to do more homework and study more history to understand that we have neither of these things in the United States or in these two leaders. Although Biden is one of the most Marxist-Leninist leaders we've ever had. Now, Mr. Azzarello left a manifesto at his death. Here's what some of it read. "My name is Max Azzarello, and I'm an investigative researcher who has set himself on fire outside of the Trump trial in Manhattan. This extreme act of protest is to draw attention to an urgent and important discovery. We are victims of a totalitarian con, and our own government, along with many of their allies, is about to hit us with an apocalyptic fascist world coup." These claims sound like fantastical conspiracy theory, but they are not. They are proof of conspiracy. If you investigate this mountain of research, you will prove them too. Yes, these claims themselves are enough proof that Biden and Trump are conspiring against the United States together. He also wrote about a Ponzi scheme involving tech billionaire Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley Bank, and cryptocurrency that will destroy the stock market. He believed the elites are a secret kleptocracy, which is true to an extent, but the key word is secret, because he thought all of our elections are totally fabricated, like a show, so that the kleptocrats can control everything from the shadows. This was one of the craziest parts. He thought that Walt Disney, the Beatles, George Orwell, and Matt Groening, which is the Simpsons creator, that they were all a part of a propaganda machine to cover for this secret fascists. His LinkedIn picture was him posing with Bill Clinton. And on there, on his LinkedIn page, his work history showed that he had worked for Tom Suzy in New York and Ami Bera in California. Both of these are Democrats in the House of Representatives. He also worked for Liberty Hill, a social justice organization in Los Angeles. His Instagram account handle was dip_secrets. You can fill in the blank there. And on Reddit, his name was anarcho-communist, which is a compound of anarchist and communist. And all of this makes perfect sense. My purpose today is not to contradict the statements or the beliefs or the philosophy of Mr. Azzarello. I just want to focus on how someone becomes this lunatic, this insane, and this narcissistic. How does one get to the point, not only where they believe such things, but that their own self-sacrifice or self-immolation will spark the revolution and change, the change that they so desire. This isn't like the Buddhist monk who sacrificed himself in 1963 in Vietnam. You all have seen that world-renowned photo of him sitting in the street on fire. Vietnam was under communist oppression, and the Buddhists more so than the others there. It was also 1963, so this photo spread like a wildfire, pun intended, demonstrating to the world the oppression and suffering and persecution of the Vietnamese people. I mean, it was just 2 years after that picture that we started sending significant numbers of American troops to liberate Vietnam and contain communism in Southeast Asia. And that's not even remotely the situation that we have here and in 2024. How does one arrive at such a level of delusion that you're convinced that burning yourself to death has historic and societal implications? A level of derangement that tells you that polar opposite candidates are actually on the same team, which seeks to flip the totalitarian switch on the American population. Well, the only road to this end is liberalism and progressivism. That's the only way that you get there. The reason I raise this story is that it exemplifies the end of liberal logic. Liberalism is aptly named progressivism because it's a progression away from reality and truth and into the fiery abyss, which is a literal spiritual hell, an economic disaster, and a worldly desolation. Max's death is truly heartbreaking and sad because his life was actually destroyed by his descent down a path of mental insanity fueled by leftism. You know, we talk about this phobia of Trump, or as it's called, Trump derangement syndrome. And it's all the same thing. It's like a mental illness, a virus, leftist lunacy, brain rot, whatever you want to call it. Speaking of leftist lunacy, protests and demonstrations have broken out at some of our elite colleges and schools across the country, the worst of which is at Columbia University in New York, and I'll summarize it and explain it as simply as I can. These anti-Israel protests may be the new BLM for the upcoming election. These kids are identifying themselves with Hamas. You know, the terrorist organization. In the softest demonstrations, they're calling for a divestment from the school's involvement with Israel in research and studies and financial ties, etc. In the worst cases, though, they're calling for Israel's extinction, which is coincidentally exactly what Hamas wants. They want to exterminate all the Jews. That is what Hamas wants. That's what the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, means. It means no more Jewish people in Israel. They claim Israel is committing genocide. Israel is committing genocide, when it's literally Hamas who committed genocidal acts of terrorism on October 7th, which was the catalyst for this entire war. And a lot of these students don't even believe that happened. It's just like Holocaust denial. They don't even believe that it happened. But the reality is that Israel's just, minding its own business, as always, and an Islamic terror group invades their southeastern gate and then proceed to murder over 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children and capture over 200 hostages, which they're still detaining. They burned babies to death in their cribs. They decapitated innocent parents. They wired people together and burned them alive. They paraded a lifeless and recently raped corpse around in the streets. And I could go on and on and on. There were hours and hours and hours of footage and pictures that circulated online. But these young, impressionable, and quite frankly, imbecilic college students have been brainwashed into thinking the kid who always gets picked on is the bad guy. Well, after a few weeks of this, schools, states, and more started shutting them down. Administration is even finally bucking their demands. In total, across the country, more than 600 people have been detained for reasons which you'll see in just a moment. But this perfectly illustrates something that I've been saying for months now. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you can say anything that you want. You can only say things within legal limits. Another thing is that's in the First Amendment is the freedom of assembly. But the key constitutional wording is the freedom to peaceably assemble. So in these liberal states, these schools allowed them to surpass the boundary of acceptable. But in other states like Texas and Florida, these protests and demonstrations were shut down almost immediately. Florida University put out an incredibly simple list of rules. Allowable activities and prohibited items and activities. There were only 3 things that they listed that were allowed: speech, expressing viewpoints, and holding signs in hands. That's it. The prohibitions was a much longer list, and it included no amplified sound, no demonstrations inside buildings, no littering, no sleeping, no unmanned signs, no blocking ingress and egress, no building of structures, chairs, stakes, benches, tables, no camping, no disruption, no threats, no violence, no weapons, or any other items and or activities deemed to be non-compliant with policy and regulations by university officials. And then, at the bottom of the page, they listed the consequences for non-compliance. Individuals found responsible for engaging in prohibited activities shall be trespassed from campus. Students will receive a 3-year trespass and suspension. Employees will be trespassed and separated from employment. In other words, you'll be fired. Well, that's one way to shut it down and keep it civil, as is constitutionally allowed. Now, we turn to Arizona State University, where state troopers were called in to expel the law-breaking protesters. And in this clip, you can see a whole squad of frat boys tearing down the Palestinian flags and encampment gear. Watch.
Look at these. Right. We've got the white frat boys throwing away protesters' belongings, and we've got the pigs in brown doing nothing about it, although we are being forced off campus. Pigs in brown.
At Emory University in Georgia, officers and state troopers used rubber bullets and tear gas to drive out protesters. There's also this clip, which went viral because it says a lot about the toddlers who attend our universities.
You're hurting me! You're hurting me! Ow! 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 Help! Help!
Now let's take a look at UCLA, where an anonymous group set up a large outdoor movie screen, barricaded with a sound system, playing October 7th footage on a loop for the protesters to see and hear who they were supporting. Watch. If you're listening on audio and you can't speak Arabic, the transcript read the following. Hi, Dad. Dad, I'm talking to you from a Jewish woman's phone. I killed her. And I killed her husband. Open my WhatsApp now and you'll see all those killed. Look how many I killed with my own hands. Your son killed Jews. Dad, I killed 10. 10 with my own hands. Their blood is on their hands. Put Mom on. And then Mom says, oh, my son, God bless you. And then, Mom, your son is a hero. Kill, 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 kill them. Seems like a sweet family. A worthy cause to get behind. I mean, that's what so many of our brilliant college students think. This was a brilliant idea for whoever pulled this off. Now, let's look at one last place. This is at NYU. And this one is probably the most telling of all. Watch this.
And what would you say is the main goal with tonight's protest?
I think the goal is just showing our support for Palestine and demanding that NYU stops. I honestly don't know all of what NYU is doing.
Is there something that NYU is doing?
I really don't know. I'm pretty sure they're... Do you know what NYU is doing? About what? About Israel. Why are we protesting here?
Palestine will be free!
I wish I was more educated. I'm not either. I came from Columbia. I was there up at Columbia and we came down. They said NYU students needed our support. So I came down. I heard there's lots of cops. Some people were saying it was getting dangerous.
That, my friends, is the sound of sheep. This is absolutely golden. Like, please share this clip because it shows how ridiculous this is and how incredibly stupid so many of our college classrooms and campuses actually are. They have no idea why they're there. They have no idea why they're there. We see this in the book of Acts. I think it's Acts 20 or somewhere around there where there's a riot in Ephesus, a mob that is just angry at Paul and Christianity. And Luke writes a verse there about how the mob doesn't even know what they're yelling about. They don't even know what they're rioting about. And it's the same with these students all over the country. They have no idea what they're doing. And I love how the second girl who goes to Columbia University and pays almost $70,000 a year says, I don't know, I wish I was more educated. Like, yeah, we wish you were too. You know, Thomas Sowell once said the road to hell is paved with Ivy League degrees. And what these brainiacs don't realize is that they're the useful idiots in America right now. And most federal politicians are doing absolutely nothing about this because they're scared. And all the while, Biden's education department, just think about this. At the same time, Biden's education department is trying to shut down two of the biggest Christian schools in the country, at Grand Canyon University and Liberty University. But that's a conversation for another day. Now, speaking of colleges and pushing back against the crazy liberals, activists love to tour the country to engage in debates and open mics at colleges around the country. And like Ben Shapiro used to do this a lot. Charlie Kirk does this now with Turning Point USA, and he does a fantastic job. Well, Charlie's the one that shared this clip of David Hogg, a gun control activist that's speaking at Dartmouth, speaking of Ivy League schools. And this clip is from the Q&A portion of the night. And this is Lily Tong Williams asking an incredible question. She's a Chinese immigrant. Watch.
Hi, my name is Lily Tong Williams. Welcome to my Live Free or Die state. Actually, I am a Chinese immigrant who survived communism. And under Mao, 40 million people were starving to death after he sold communism to them. And 20 million people died, murdered during his Cultural Revolution. So my question to you, David, is that can you guarantee me, a gun owner tonight, our government in the U.S., in D.C., will never become a tyrannical government? Can you guarantee that to me?
there's no way I can ever guarantee that any government will not be tyrannical.
Well, then the debate on gun control is over because I will never give up my guns. Never, never. And you should go to China to see how gun control works for dictatorship of CCP.
Can you guarantee that our government will never become a tyrannical government? No, of course not. Well, then the debate is over. And then they pulled the mic away from her at the end like, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't speak such devastating facts and logic. So, you see, here we are, 231 years after the ratifying of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And we're still the freest nation on earth. And I don't talk about this a lot, although one of my earlier episodes was about Christians and gun control. But the difficult concept that a lot of Americans cannot grasp or fathom is the shield that the Second Amendment is for the preservation of liberty and a constraint against government. Dave Chappelle once said, the First Amendment is first for a reason. The Second Amendment is just in case the first one doesn't work out. And it's important to always remember that the Bill of Rights is mostly about what the government cannot do. And most people only focus on the bad things that happen with guns, the violence, the gang violence, school shootings, mass shootings, accidents, etc. And they see these things and think that the tools for this murderous trade should be confiscated. But because they have a myopic view of world history and an ignorance of the founders' logic, they fail to realize the vastly more deadly society that exists without these rights. And this one in particular. People will point to data on gun ownership and gun violence and gun-related deaths, etc., and draw connections to make arguments for gun control. But if you look around the world, something seems really off. Like when you look at all of the world's information on guns and gun violence, the United States owns more guns per capita than any country in the world. Like it's not even close. But in second place, you have Yemen. In third place, you have Switzerland, then Finland, and then Serbia in fifth place. With the exception of Yemen, given the militant Muslims there, the firearms related death in Switzerland and Finland and Serbia is very low. And those are the top 5 gun owning per capita countries in the world. So the question is, why is the United States so much higher? And this is where the problem actually lies. Why are Americans being killed almost 6 times more in gun-related deaths than any other nation? Well, it's not the volume of weapons. It's the condition of our souls. They never mention the fact that these statistics also include suicides, a person killing themselves with a firearm. And in practically every mass shooting incident, you have a psychopath who would inevitably resort to whatever means necessary to set the world on fire, even if the guns were completely banished. I'm sure that I'll be banned from the internet for this segment, but hey, let's try one more. The NFL draft is going on this week, but the WNBA draft was only just a few weeks ago. The number 1 player in the draft was, of course, the player who has brought significantly more attention to women's basketball than anyone else, Caitlin Clark. So she was the first pick. She signed with the Indiana Fever. If I'm being honest, I'd never even heard of this team until now, but a lot of the modern feminists blew a gasket when they found out that Clark's player salary would earn her less than $80,000 a year. And this is comparing the best female in basketball, her salary, to, for example, the best male basketball player, LeBron James, that he brought home over $47 million this season, just from the Lakers. And you can even compare Clark's starting $80,000 a year to the top pick in the NBA draft last year, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but the Spurs pay him $12 million a year. So $12 million a year for the top pick in the NBA draft, to $80,000 a year to the top pick in the WNBA draft. So the feminists are decrying the gender pay gap, as they call it. Here's what Joe Biden had to say about it. Women in sports continue to push new boundaries and inspire us all. But right now, we're seeing that even if you're the best, women are not paid their fair share. It's time that we give our daughters the same opportunities as our sons and ensure women are paid what they deserve. Okay, well, let's talk about the fair share and what they quote unquote deserve. What is a fair share of zero profit? What's a fair share of that? How much do you deserve from an organization who has never turned a profit, no matter the season? It's reported in numerous outlets, from the mouth of the commissioner, that the WNBA loses around $10 million a year. Loses. So how do you determine a fair share of that? How do you pay the average WNBA player a comparable salary to an NBA player when an NBA player sells vastly more tickets and merchandise than the other? The truth that you find here, and whenever you research these supposed incidents of gender pay disparity, is that these WNBA athletes are getting their fair share and what they deserve from the league. From the league. Caitlin Clark may be making $80,000 from the Indiana Fever, but Nike is paying her $28 million over 8 years and is making her own signature shoe. When she was in college, she made over $3 million on NIL deals with State Farm, Gatorade, and others. In that analysis, Clark is making more than a bunch of NBA players. Does she deserve that? Is that fair? And is deservedness or fairness a matter of skill or profitability? Like, which one is it? Because if it's a matter of skill, I'm fairly certain that almost every single player in the NBA could outplay Clark, which is another huge factor in the pay disparity. But if the fairness concerns profit, then Clark is getting exactly what she deserves. She's far more valuable in that sense than most of the NBA players, and that's why she's getting such huge deals and endorsements. Well, that's going to do it for me. What'll it be next time? We'll see. For now, go and be the salt and light you are meant to be, and we'll see you next time on We the Free. Thanks for watching this clip. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it, so do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we'd love for you to check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch and to spread the word of We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think you'll like. Now go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.